Thank you very much, Joanna, for speaking to us today.
Yeah.
When you were talking about prayer and spiritual growth, you mentioned a lot about turning to God or and noticing things, and kind of language was quite helpful.
Yeah. I think it's in 1 Thessalonians that Paul says, pray constantly. And sometimes the church has interpreted that as you have to say your prayers lots of times during the day. But another way of looking at it, and I think perhaps a more helpful way, is just being aware that you are always in God's presence, for God is always with us. And just stopping and remembering that and noticing. And the idea of turning, I think, is helpful because it means you step out of your normal ways of being in the world and your normal ways of thinking, and you turn towards God, you turn aside, you see things from a different perspective. And you actually have to slow down and stop in order to turn as well. So you remember that God is always with you, and I think remembering and turning are very closely linked as well. If you think about the story of the prodigal son, he remembers his father, gets up, turns and goes back home. And we're used to thinking of that as being about repentance, but I think it's also a good model of prayer. You notice stuff because you turn aside, like Moses with the burning bush.
Thank you very much. You also spoke a little bit about mystical experiences. I wonder if you could just explain how you understand mystical experiences and then how you discern something of the presence of God in them.
I think as a psychologist, I'm very used to understanding mystical experiences along the dimensions first identified by William James, which is that they are ineffable. That means they're hard to put into words. That there's a sense of passivity, that you are lifted out of yourself, that there's a sense of something deep being revealed to you, that they may not last very long, and perhaps more important than any of those others, something that other psychologists picked up later, which is this idea of unity, that you are unified with the cosmos, that you are unified within yourself, that everything connects and makes sense and you have a place in it. And I think you find that experience across faith traditions. You find it in people who may not call themselves theists, and it looks as if this is an experience that's quite common. And the question then is, if the meaning and purpose and knowledge that is revealed to you in those situations, how do we know that's of God? And I think that's why there's such a strong tradition in the church of the discipline of discernment and of the need for people to test everything, because not everything that looks exciting and different and that takes you out of yourself may necessarily be God-given. And one of the good principles there is you will know these things by their fruit. And fruit bearing traditionally takes a long time. So sometimes it takes a long time to be sure that something is of God and not spurious. But we stand in a tradition, if we go back to the Old Testament, where this was a troubling thing for the prophets as well. Knowing which were the true prophets and which were false prophets was something that people had to wrestle with a lot then. And we still need to wrestle with now and not get too distracted by the form of the experience, but listen to the message and whether it's consistent with what we know about the way God has revealed himself in Jesus Christ.
Thank you. You mentioned the troubled lives of the prophets, or alluded to them there. In terms of the troubled world in which we sometimes live, you've also spoken about how we approach that with a sense of thankfulness and the growing use of mindfulness in both within the Christian world and outside it. Have you found that a helpful approach?
I think it is a helpful approach. I think we recognise that we seem to be living, I think every generation thinks it's living in particularly troubled times, but I do think at the moment it feels as if there's a great anxiety in the world and in our own nation in particular that is showing itself in unhelpful ways. and is particularly making young people very ill at ease. Things to do with climate change, things to do with political structures, and so on. Things to do with the internet and the way communication works these days, all put pressures on, particularly on our young people. And right back in Judaism, there is this dual habit of giving thanks to God, recognizing that our life is a gift and nothing we do earns it. We're not entitled to it, but this is just gift, and enjoying it. And meditating. In Judaism, meditating on the law of God. And the thing about meditation is that it's one of those things that helps us turn. So it's a doorway into prayer, because it helps us to set aside all the noise that is in our head and to attend to the still small voice, to attend to what is important and what is not urgent. And mindfulness, which we find everywhere, although is often associated with Buddhism, actually is something that if we go back into our own tradition, we'll find that has been used, something very like it for many years, and I think we should embrace more positively.
Thank you. You've taken an interest in prayer and how that affects people with dementia. Do people with dementia still have a spiritual life and experience? And if they do, how can that be supported?
I think the situation of people with dementia, which of course is so varied, nevertheless shows us that we shouldn't be distracted by outward forms in understanding the spiritual life. So I think what happens to a person with dementia is that their spiritual life may change. It may change in ways that make it perhaps almost unrecognisable to the rest of us, but that doesn't mean that it has ceased. And there are some things that come with dementia which actually can intensify the spiritual life. An ability to stay in the present moment because you're not distracted by planning ahead or remembering stuff you need to do because you've forgotten it. So rather like a child, you can just enjoy the present. There is a setting aside of language, of logical thinking, and often a rediscovery of more poetic modes of thinking and of memories based on feelings. And a really important principle in being alongside someone with dementia is that even if they don't seem to notice you are there or to respond to you or to recognise you, their bodily and emotional memory may still be working, so that after you have gone, they may still have a sense of your presence with them and a deep sense of connectedness, a very deep kind of spirituality, which is actually what the rest of us are always trying to get at in prayer, is that sense of presence and connectedness. And I think that is there for many, many people with dementia, even if it looks like nothing is going on.
Joanna, thank you very much indeed.